Committee the need for increased sea lift capacity. How is the Navy addressing the TRANSCOM Commander's #1 request for increased sea lift? What is your assessment of the current ready reserve fleet and the ability of it to support the national defense strategy?
Sir, as I'm sure General Lyons told you, we currently meet the requirements, but that fleet is aging out quickly, and so the need for recapitalization there is urgent. We're working very closely with TRANSCOM and also Admiral Busby. We are taking sort of a three-pronged approach. One is to do life extensions where those life extensions make fiscal sense. The second approach is to buy used ships that will meet the requirements, and we're taking advantage of all the authorities that Congress has given us with respect to buying used. And then the third is to build new. And so it's the combination of those three. Right now, though, I think we're also I'm interested in having a discussion in terms of how we can best incentivize domestic shipbuilding in the United States of America. And I think that all of this would help not only the sea lift part of TRANSCOM's issues, but also alleviate some of the costs for DoD shipbuilding, Navy shipbuilding. And so I think that that would be a good thing to discuss as part of this as well.
And additionally, Admiral, I appreciate how the budget invests in continuing to rebuild aviation readiness. What lessons have the Navy and Marine Corps learned from pursuing former Secretary Mattis's goal of 80% mission capability for the strike fighter aircraft?
Yes, sir. I think the Secretary has described it that we are really going outside to take a look at what are the commercial best practices. And we've brought a lot of those ideas in-house. And so in terms of workflow, establishing that workflow and maintaining it, that's allowed us to have a steady ramp towards achieving that 80% readiness, and we're optimistic that that's going to happen. And then the stable funding has allowed us to refill parts bins and parts baskets that were previously empty, and so that's also reducing the time in maintenance.
Again, Congressman, I got to beep just for a second, yes, because readiness right now, Navy Marine Corps team, F-18s, 67 to 70%, which when I was here a year ago, we were nowhere near that.
Progress.
Gentleman's time has expired. Again, going in order, I'm going to yield myself 5 minutes. And first of all, I just want to start by saying, as someone who's been on the Sea Power Committee for the last 4 or 5 years, I want to thank all the witnesses for their great work. In particular, Admiral Richardson and General Neller, as you start to head towards the exit. Again, both of you served straddling 2 administrations, 2 national security reviews, and have really, I think, done an outstanding job in terms of just integrity and excellence. And again, I want to thank you publicly. I'd like to focus for a second on the inclusion of funding to build a 3rd Virginia-class submarine in the 2020 budget to be actually executed in the 2023 timeframe. From a strategic standpoint, this is a step to more rapidly reach 66 attack submarines called for in the 2016 Force Structure Assessment. Today, of course, the fleet stands at 51 and will drop to 42 by 2006. Admiral Richardson, can you state what the impact of even 1 additional attack submarine would have on the Navy's operational capability? Can you discuss what types of O-plans it would help support in an unclassified setting?
Sir, I'll do my best. One is that with respect to our greatest gap between the warfighting requirement and current inventory, there's no greater need than the attack submarine fleet, as you highlighted just with the numbers. It's a wide gap, and it's getting wider. So every single submarine counts against closing that gap. Why do we need that force level? Well, in the O-plans, I think it's safe to say in this forum that particularly the more stressing O-plans in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, the first failings, the first response among them are going to be the submarine response. And they're going to go out there early. They're going to use their stealth and speed to get into far forward areas and really establish the conditions for the rest of the joint force to execute their part of the campaign. And so right now we're stressed to meet those requirements just because of the force level in particular, combined with maintenance. And so every single submarine counts. If you think about a submarine going out there with 26 tubes in its torpedo room and missiles on board as well, and coming back empty, it's a tremendous influence on the battle space there. And that asymmetric aspect of it to open the door for the rest of the joint force.
Thank you. And again, just to follow up, there's been some discussion, the fact that we're funding this sub outside the block contract program, which is 2 subs a year. There's been some questions raised about whether or not it's adding risk in terms of the Columbia program, which obviously is happening pretty much in that same time frame. I was wondering if you could just, sort of explain whether or not doing it this way actually, with flexibility, will in fact maybe help de-risk the Columbia program.
So that's exactly how I see it, and I was up at Electric Boat just last week to have them walk me through that from their perspective. First, I've got to say, what a great situation where a lot of this involves workforce, bringing workforce on, and all of our shipbuilders, but it was very vivid there at Electric Boat, are bringing in so many young people. About 50% of the workforce has less than 5 years of experience now, which is just such a terrific story in terms of building those skills to do welding, pipe fitting, electricians, et cetera. So that's part of it. They showed me their workload curves and how they're actually going to use this to mitigate peaks and valleys, smooth out their level of effort. If we get the flexibility to do this, as you said, we'll fund it in 20 because the SCN profile is much smoother then, and then we'll execute it as a 23 ship because that smooths out the workforce. So the combination of that really is almost a stabilizer rather than an increased risk.
Thank you, appreciate that. And then one quick question, again, one of the initiatives is the unmanned vessels that are, again, are part of the budget here. And again, I think there's enthusiastic recognition that this is where the future is going to be headed. But in terms of just, investing upfront this year, I just wonder if the two of you could comment a little bit in terms of whether or not, we're getting a little ahead of our skis in terms of creating a program where the mission set isn't quite developed yet, and, hopefully we won't repeat some of the mistakes of the past.
Let me go first on that, if I could, and then hand it over to the CNO. Congressman, it's a great observation, but one of the things that you have charged us with is to go smartly, go quickly, and go intelligently. We believe that what we put before you is the intelligent way to go. It's in size. I completely agree with that, but we're going to experiment with it. We're going to actually, quote unquote, break it, figure out what to do, learn with it, and then go forward. This is the way we go fast.
So I'll just add on, we're going to leverage a lot of work that we've already done with the Strategic Capabilities Office, particularly for the 20 ships, and so we've got those really kind of underway. And then for the follow-on, again, as the Secretary discussed, leveraging mature technology and then getting after those things with respect to autonomy and unmanned that we just really have to explore those. And this is not a capability that we want to cede to the adversary because it's going to be decisive when we get it right. That's why we've parked it in the research and development line. I think that's the appropriate place to do work like this where so many questions remain to be explored.
Thank you to all of you. Mr. Scott, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, I think that hurricane hit Camp Lejeune September 14th. Is that date correct?
Yes, sir.
How are things at Camp Lejeune now?
There have been repairs made. The people are back occupying those buildings that they can still occupy. So there were 2 impacts. One was on the public housing, or the PPV housing. The vendor there has fixed about 50% of those houses. We've gone through and done what we could do with the appropriations and the resources we had, and we have reprogrammed some money, but we've come up with a list of about 31 buildings that we believe the cost of repair exceeds the value of the building and that it'd be better off to build new. Some of those buildings were already in the future program. We want to bring them to the left. But the end result is we have a bill, if you take away the $400 million that we got last week on reprogramming, we have a bill of about $3.1 billion over the next 3 or 4 years where we think where we need to fix the base so that we don't have to go through this again.
Is it safe to say that that things will continue to degrade unless some type of supplemental disaster assistance or appropriation is passed for Camp Lejeune?
Well, yes, they will. Otherwise, we're going to have to figure out how we're going to have to self-fund this. So whether there's reprogramming done within the department or there's a supplemental, we don't have insurance. The Congress is our insurance.
Yes, sir.
So
As is the White House. It's Congress and the White House. It takes both to get disaster relief passed.
yes, sir.
Hurricane Michael hit my district, and we haven't received disaster assistance yet either. I know Vice President Pence, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, flew down there in two Marine Corps Ospreys on October 16th. We are with you, and we will stay with you until we rebuild and recover better than ever before, is the statement. And yet, to this day, we have not received a request for disaster assistance from the Office of Management and Budget. And I'm a little taken back with what's happened at Camp Lejeune and with the Corps and the damage and the need that you have for a supplemental appropriations bill, as well as the Air Force, who has basically had to take what they had in operation and maintenance money left over and use it to rebuild as best they can Tyndall. And now the Air Force is about to be in a situation where they're going to be stopping flying unless some type of supplemental appropriations is done. Congress is about to go on vacation for 2 weeks. The White House hasn't even submitted a request for assistance, and I'm embarrassed, quite honestly, that this job hasn't been done. Now, to be clear, there's politics being played on the Senate side. If the storm had hit Vermont, or if the storm had hit New York, or if the storm had hit a blue state, then senators from New York and Vermont would not be standing in the way of this package passing. But have any of you talked with the White House about the need for a supplemental disaster assistance package?
Not directly, Congressman.
Secretary Spencer, I would suggest, I have a tremendous amount of respect for you. I have a tremendous amount of respect for both of you too. But I think the number one thing you could do for the men and women in the Navy and the Marine Corps is to speak directly with the White House about the need for supplemental assistance. I do not think that the President of the United States, I do not think President Trump would be allowing Congress to go home for 2 weeks if he knew what was about to happen to the readiness of the Air Force and the Corps. I think that he would be challenging us on to stay here and get this job done, and I think that we could get beyond the petty politics in the Senate, but we want to be a part of the solution. I'm embarrassed that we're going home. These storms hit 7 months ago for you. They hit 6 months ago for me. Farmers in my area are filing bankruptcy, even though they were promised disaster assistance. It hasn't come. You guys need it just like we do. And I hope, Secretary, that you and the other secretaries will speak with the White House about the damage that's going to be done by not getting a disaster relief bill passed before we go home for Easter. Thank you. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. Mr. Golden.
Thank you. Secretary Spencer and Admiral Richardson, I want to talk just a little bit about shipbuilding readiness for a moment. The Navy's FY20 report to Congress on the annual long-range plan for construction of naval vessels noted, that's a quote, that a healthy and efficient industrial base continues to be the fundamental driver for achieving and sustaining the Navy's baseline acquisition profiles, and that the shipbuilding base is a matter of national security that's unique and must be protected. As leaders, I know you both know from experience that producing people with the right skill sets isn't just not something that occurs overnight and takes a great deal of training and instruction. So I was very pleased by both of your remarks, where you put an emphasis on the importance of education and training, as well as support for both public and private shipyards. And as you know, trained shipbuilders We've got some great ones up at Bath Iron Works, and it's something that it requires some time and investment in workers. It typically takes like 5 to 7 years of training in order to get someone to achieve shipbuilding proficiency. And with the Navy's plans to expand the fleet, I wanted to hear your thoughts on what you're doing to encourage young men and women to enter into the shipbuilding profession, and what you're doing to help private and public shipyards with recruitment. I think about this in regards to younger folks, whether they're coming out of high school or looking to get into the trades, or even individuals like myself leaving the service who are looking for potential career opportunities. Is anything that you are doing with the shipyards for recruitment or training, and what can Congress do to assist and help you reach that, the objective?
Congressman, that's a great observation, and it's happening throughout the whole shipbuilding industry, both sides of the Mississippi, but I'm going to bring Maine out as a specific example. I was up there right after my confirmation hearing visiting Bath, and the community colleges in the area there had no exposure or no plans to have a curriculum to support what the basic skill sets are, nor the high schools. I was very encouraged on my last visit up a month ago to see that both the community college and the high schools are adopting primary skill sets and advanced curriculum in this area. I mean, it is across the board in the U.S. I think we have to address this, because at the end of the day, a level 3 welder and or any other artisan in the shipbuilding, aviation assembling field, it's a very nice career to have.
So I'll just pile on to what the Secretary said and add to my comments that this is really something that's exciting around the nation, and every one of our shipbuilding centers and ship repair centers as well, both public and private. With respect to the public shipyards, oftentimes we're sort of drawn from the same pool, but it's really a team effort, right? We go out as a Navy and try and recruit. Some people want to ride and operate those ships as sailors. Some people want to design and build those ships as shipbuilders or ship repairers. But the apprentice programs, the teaming with the community colleges, even down to the high school level, they're really pulling out the stops, and they're responding to the demand signal for more shipbuilding, right? That's the thing that really is the most fundamental element of this. And so as we continue to grow the Navy, build more ships, they're gonna have places to go after they go through this training. So that's the most important thing.
Thank you for those thoughts, and I think the community colleges in Maine are doing a good job, and the unions have got some great apprenticeship training programs. They really make an investment in the workers and helping young people get set up for success. So I thank you for working to help them in any way that you can. And there's some interesting work being done in Maine with some individuals that are starting to get into the business of trying to recruit for the shipyard and going down, traveling around to bases and other places to show people that there's a good career waiting for them up in Maine. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Just real quickly, I wanted to give you an opportunity, Admiral. We heard from Vice Admiral Mers about the coming online of the Flight 3 DDG, and just wanted to hear your thoughts on what that's going to do to help the fleet, both in regards to new capabilities, but also your overall goal of getting to a fleet of 355.
I'll tell you what, the capabilities on the Flight 3 DDG, its sensors, its weapons, the whole, it just has a battle space control that is going to add a tremendous amount of capability, not only as a single ship, but in concert with the rest of the ships in the strike group and the fleet. And so as we think about distributed maritime operations, that type of capability is key. The fact that we're leveraging the learning curve that we've got already on the DDG 51 class and just modernizing that is also a benefit. And then we're looking for the next thing as well, because with the Flight 3, the DDG is about maxed out, not a whole lot more room to expand beyond that. And so working with industry, just as the Secretary said, to bring them in early to make sure we have a smoother transition to the next large surface combatant.
Thank you. Mr. Byrne for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Richardson and General Neller, I just want to say how much I appreciate your service to our country, and I want to tell you how much I appreciate your work with this committee and with me personally. It's been an honor and pleasure to know you and to work with you, and we wish you the best of luck in the years to come. Mr. Secretary, you have been very gracious in all the time you spent with me as you've heard my worries about the small service combatant program, and I'm very pleased to see that we're making the shift to the frigate in this year's budget. So I know you've worked very hard on that. Thank you. I do continue to be concerned about the price point because we now, on the initial ship, are up to almost $1.3 billion with additional requirements. And so what I worry about is, when we start getting these these acquisition programs, the costs up like this, we tend to cut back on the numbers. So are we still aiming for $800 million on the follow-on ships and still trying to get to 20?
That is correct, Congressman. If anything, and I share your consternation, we have, as you know, 5 robust platforms that we're going to be entertaining, which makes this probably one of the most competitive platform acquisition programs that we'll have, so we're quite excited about that. We look at the learning curves on those hulls that are already out there, and they're very impressive. The reason I paused for a second is that I read the latest GAO report on the Columbia, and one of the things that Navy is criticized for is not estimating the costs in an appropriate manner, that we underestimated. I'm hoping, and I'm pretty confident that the number that we're projecting here is the first ship number, and it's going to be a conservative number, but we are definitely driving for the $800 million number.
Well, good, because I don't think you're going to get to 20 if you jump it up much higher than 800. You know all the competition for the other ships that we're trying to construct, so please forgive me if I don't continue to bring that up. It's just a continued concern of mine.
Please do.
Yes, I will. General Miller, I had the privilege of leading the HASC group that went out to RIMPAC last summer, and we were looking forward to getting underway on the Bonhomme Richard, but couldn't because it couldn't sail. We were also supposed to have the Boxer out there, but it couldn't participate. I'm concerned about the amphibious program and our readiness. Do I have a legitimate concern? Do you have a concern about where we are on the amphib program?
We worked really hard with the Navy on the maintenance processes for amphib ships, and I believe the Navy has a backlog and a number of platforms for maintenance. So yes, we're concerned about the availability of these platforms. This is not something that happened overnight, and we've been funding maintenance and readiness at a higher level. So we're hoping to see a better availability of these ships, but it is something that the CO and I talk about, and he's tracking all this as we are, making sure that the platforms we do have are available and they have the mods and other changes they need. So we're not where we want to be, but we're continuing to work on it.
Thank you, General. Admiral, we continue to hear more and more about China and its naval operations, and presently around an island that's in dispute, or an island of rock that's in dispute between it and the Philippines. Can you enlighten us where we are on that?
Sir, I think the word for the one word I would use to characterize that is consistency. Our actions are consistent with our words, and that's a very important body of water, the South China Sea, and about 1/3 of the world's trade goes through there. And so we've got tremendous national interest in making sure that trade flows freely through there, unthreatened. We've been consistently present in that part of the world for 70 years, and we're going to remain consistently present there and continue to advocate with our allies for free and open seas so that we fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows.
And I assume that the shipbuilding plan that you've submitted is your best estimate about what you're going to need short-term, near-term, and long-term to keep up with or stay ahead of the threat from the Chinese.
It's exactly addresses that strategy in every single hull, right? It's a very strategically informed budget, and so all of the entire budget really is leaning in that direction. Yes, sir.
Well, I thank you both, all three of you, for what you do. I think it's tremendously important to the defense of the country, and I certainly want to give my full support to all of your efforts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman, and I want to echo previous statements of thanking all of you for your service and wish you well as you move on in life. I know you won't go far. Secretary Spencer and Admiral Richardson, according to Naval Aviation Long-Term Tactical Aircraft Inventory Plans, 50-50 split is the percentage you're looking at between fourth and fifth generation fighters with the F-35C. The rationale between that 50-50 split across the entire globe. Can you explain to us why you came up with the 50-50 split?
I'll take a first cut at that, Congressman, and then offer the CNO to dive in also. In the job here that I wear in the Title X hat, it's portfolio management. Obviously, I'd love to have every single thing that I asked for, but I can't have it. When it comes to bringing the F-35 into the Navy fight, this is the most efficient and effective way that we believe we could do it, which is basically to feather in the F-35 Charlie, augmented by the Super Hornets. And that is both Super Hornet new and the SLEP program for the Super Hornet. So eventually we're getting to 100% fifth gen. We also have to figure in that we have the next generation fighter, which we're now just beginning to do some analysis on, and that should be brought into the argument also.
After the F-35, you're actually doing that analysis 30 years ahead or 20 years?
Yes, we're starting it now.
Admiral Richardson.
So I'll just echo what the Secretary said. I think he captured it completely. If you look at the capability of the future air wing, it's going to include that mixture of fourth and fifth gen, each of which contributes uniquely to the air power of that air wing. And then, of course, we're bringing in the unmanned tanker as well, so that we extend the range of that air wing and allow strike fighter aircraft to do the strike fighter mission instead of the tanking mission. And so it's really, a whole air wing approach as we move forward.
So as you move forward to 2030 and you start dealing with the near-peer competitors, particularly in the East China Sea, do you see that ratio changing over the course of the next 20 years?
We're going to stick with what we've got right now, sir, and we'll learn as we go forward. And then, as the Secretary said, we're already looking at what it's going to take to maintain air dominance even beyond fifth generation. And so we've got to start introducing that capability in the 2030s, and so it's time to get thinking about that now.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norcross. Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you. Secretary Spencer, your Navy cyber review, I believe, ID'd contractors as a huge vulnerability, really the soft underbelly of Navy cybersecurity. Just to follow up on what Representative Langevin talked about, could you please comment on the severity of the contractor threat? And if you would also address, I believe you're proposing a fifth Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity. The Navy already obviously has a CIO. You have an OpNav cybersecurity division run by a two-star. So the proposal, I think, begs the question, what are those existing positions not empowered to do that you believe an Assistant Secretary for Cyber would be able to do?
To answer your two questions, Congressman, yes, one of the most vulnerable Achilles heels we have is our supplier base. And that, I think you appreciate, that ranges from Fortune 100 companies, Fortune 50 companies, on down to, I'll use the term mom and pop, the small business world. We have to be able to encompass and provide them avenues to protect our data. One reason that we're going to the cloud allows that ability to provide an avenue for some smaller organization to be encrypted, to be protected without encumbering a lot of cost on them. That is one of the things we're after. When it comes to the fifth Assistant Secretary, that will be the compilation of what we have in the organization already at the Secretariat level. And to remind you, Secretariat level is more we're a policy performer, and then the services themselves are the tactical enactors. So we'll be a support mechanism for that, providing the structure and the gray matter needed to actually put the policy out there and assist in the creation of the infrastructure around it.
And just, yes, Admiral.
If I could, sir, I'd just add on that we've taken some very near-term actions already, even before the cybersecurity study, in terms of tightening up the contractual relationship with a lot of those partners in the defense industrial base, and so encrypting their data at rest and in transit, two-method authentication, increasing the transparency into their systems, the oversight of those systems, the response of those systems, and so we're moving out with urgency here.
And Admiral Richardson, if I could, the National Defense Strategy obviously has this massive conceptual shift towards prioritizing great power competition, China, 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 and then Russia a distant second. But contained within that is this further conceptual shift away from reliance primarily on deterrence by punishment to doing more of deterrence by denial. How has that changed, sort of that big conceptual shift in that document, changed the way the Navy is doing business? And what role will the future frigate play in conducting deterrence by denial in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, I would say that our conceptual approach to that, articulated in the Navy strategy, the design for maintaining maritime operations, is distributed maritime operations. And so the fundamental thesis of this is that we are going to complicate any adversary's targeting problem by distributing the platforms in the fleet, keeping that very distributed and dynamic, but having a network that would allow us to mass effects, whether the payloads, if you will, kinetic and non-kinetic. I'll tell you what, the frigate is going to contribute tremendously. It's going to pack a wallop, and it's going to allow us to get out there with a number of platforms and exercise this distributed maritime operations concept.
And then to follow up on that, General Neller, can you walk us through how you think U.S. withdrawal from the INF Treaty might affect your role in that fight, and specifically your EABO concept?
If we have the ability to deliver surface fires beyond the range that we are restricted by in INF, that'll put us in a better position vis-a-vis other adversaries out there. So in the EABO, Expeditionary Advanced Based Ops, we believe in conjunction with fleet operations in a naval campaign that we can use a land force to help control the maritime space. And so the longer range we have, the better opportunity we have to control greater pieces of the maritime space. So if you look at the critical geography on the globe, whether the maritime choke points, they're obviously where they are, if you control those and you have the ability to reach out and dominate the sea space from the land in support of the fleet and from the air, I think it gives you an operational advantage. And that's what we're going to try to do with these capabilities that we're going to develop. So we're lockstep with a lot of the weaponry development that the Army's doing, what the Navy's doing, with long-range anti-ship missiles and other things. There's capabilities out there, and we hope to field those and make that part of the naval campaign.
Thank you. I am out of time, but I think it also means we're going to have to teach a generation of young Marines what sea denial and sea control means and refresh that.
And I think we'll be able to do that because historically the seizure and securing of advanced naval bases in support of the naval campaign is what we have historically done. We haven't done it the last 17 years, as you rightly acknowledge and you know yourself. But I think that's going to be part of the education and training process, and we're moving out on that.
Absolutely. And thank you both for your service.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. Congresswoman Hill.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. Great to see you. Admiral Richardson, I hear lots about the talk about a bigger Navy and the need for the 355 ships, but I wanted to hear more about creating a ready Navy, what's being done differently after the McCain and Fitzgerald incidents, and to make sure that our destroyers are getting the maintenance they need. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yes, ma'am. First and foremost, with respect to the 7th Fleet, which is where we had our trouble, the most important thing we've done is just return schedule discipline to the force. Admiral Sawyer out there, the 7th Fleet Commander, Admiral Aquilina, the Pacific Fleet Commander, are supporting this with vigor. And so what this really means practically is that we don't send a warship out to do a mission until it's been trained and certified to do that mission, and we've provided adequate time and oversight to make sure that they're ready to go. Backing that up, we stood up a new command out there in Japan to make sure that there's an on-site advocate for force generation so that we get to that level of readiness, and that's stood up and working very well. And then as we go into deeper matters, we've adjusted the training profile for each of those ships. We're moving simulators, high-end simulators, out to each of the fleet concentration areas, especially and including our forward deployed naval forces. And then we've changed the career path for surface warfare officers to make sure that they get better and more training as they go through their career.
So do you feel like the maintenance needs are being met for the destroyers, or?
I'll tell you, maintenance has been a topic of conversation here at the hearing all morning, and it is probably our remaining most complicated Gordian knot to untie. And so we've got everything leaning into this. We're using the same practices that we use to improve an aircraft maintenance, going out into the private sector to look at best practices. We're starting to use a very data-centric approach. There has been some good progress made in maintenance, but we've still got a ways to go.
Thank you. Okay, so then this is in a different direction, but my brother is enlisted already. He's scheduled to go out for boot at the end of May, so very excited about that. But I was hoping you could talk about what the Navy's doing to hit its future recruitment targets. I know you mentioned earlier that there's as many as a 6,500 billet shortage. So anything you can talk about?
I'll tell you what, ma'am, knock on wood, but both the Commandant and I have enjoyed the fact that we've hit our recruiting targets for probably the last 12 years on a month-by-month basis. And I think that has a lot to do with the same factors that you're seeing in your family in terms of what draws our nation's young people to the service. It's as competitive a space as I've got anywhere, is the competition for talent. The recruiting team is doing great work. We're using some very new techniques, kind of web-based approaches to this. It's part of our transformation of our personnel and pay system, and that's yielding some pretty good results. I will tell you what, also, once you arrive at boot camp, it's a completely different scenario. You're going to learn resilience. You're going to learn so many skills there. We've actually made it tougher, but we've done it in a way that we're actually retaining more people. The graduation rate is higher, even after we've made those adjustments, because we're teaching people how to manage that stress in a much more effective way. And then finally, we have to stay true to our values, which I think is the thing that attracts our young people more than anything else.
Of course. So if the recruitment targets are being met, where are those shortages coming from, the 6,500 shortages?
This is really a leftover, if you will, from a shortage that we experienced in recruiting in 16. And so as you think about that divot moving through time, it's going to be with us until it passes through the senior ranks. But that's where we are. The most recent recruiting numbers have been much better, and we're going to see this recover, I think, in the next year or two.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. And Admiral, I was just out at Great Lakes Training Center and saw the transformation that Admiral Bernanke has brought out there, and everything you described is absolutely true. The morale and enthusiasm was off the chart, and he was making it tougher. Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, Admiral, we're going to be sorry to see you retire. For General Neller, I understand you're going out to Las Vegas and with Buck Bedard open up a casino. Is that correct?
No, Congressman, that's not correct.
Just you, huh? Anyway, I did want to talk about amphibious ships and the fact that two of them were cut out of the budget. Correct me if I'm wrong, LPDs. How much of an impact is that going to have on commitments?
There was LPD Flight 2 and an LHA, which were moved to the right in this in the program. So we've discussed, and there was advanced procurement money provided by the Congress for both of those platforms. And so in discussions yesterday and with other hearings, we believe with incremental funding, if that was permitted by the Congress, that we could probably bring those back to the left. Are they important? Yes. We still have a requirement for 38 amphib ships. We believe 12 big decks and 26 LPD similar hull forms. And so we would like to get the 38 ships. But there's other competing requirements. I understand that. Obviously, we believe that amphibs obviously are critically important in Marines, but submarines are important in Marines too, because if we don't have submarines, we're not going to get to the fight. And so I have to be, as a member of the Joint Chiefs, I have to be operationally, intellectually honest about that. But as a Marine, we need both more platforms and we need more availability from the platforms we have. So I believe if we work with the Congress on be able to spend this advanced procurement with some incremental funding, I think we can move, for sure, the LPD Flight 2 hull form, get it sooner than where it is in the program.
Sir, if I could just pile on to my partner here, is we see it the exact same way. Even with these adjustments, we are going to have 36 amphibious ships at the end of the 5-year program in FY24 against a requirement for 38, so we're taking this very seriously. with that incremental funding authority, we could get started on that LPD as soon as we get those authorities, and maybe even do better than that.
I wanted to address something that's often, I think, forgotten in the budget, and that's the Mount Warfare Training Center. And you know, this thing's been around since the 50s, the reaction to the Korean War. I think it's a great training area. I was there many, many years ago, and there's a certain part of my exterior that still hasn't thawed out since the 60s, I guess I was there. The problem, I was there recently and very, very concerned about the fire danger. As you know, you can still see the red lines where the planes, it was very, very close. And the other problem is they had a great exercise up there, but I was concerned with the helicopters and everything else because there's no security for those things. You got to have troops out there. That road that they have that they goes, it's like 50 miles away, or excuse me, it's like maybe 50, 100 meters away from where the helicopters were set for the evening during that exercise. So I'm just hoping that we can work with the Park Service, the Forestry Service, and straighten out that road, whether we have to get money or what have you. And if you could, I'm going to be studying it more and more, and any suggestions you have, because it's been like that for too long. And sooner or later, we're going to have a problem there with fires or interlopers with some very expensive equipment. And the great exercise, I thought was fantastic. But any comments on that? I don't have
Congressman, I was just up there, and they briefed me on that northern part of the training area they want to open up in the particular roads you're referring to. So I'll get back to you with whatever particular initiatives that we need. Maybe you can help us with the Park Service to be able to improve that road and be able to open up that training area, at least for maneuver, and also so we can get into the training area from a different direction in case we have an issue that we need to address. But I'll owe you that, and I'll get back to you on that.
I appreciate it. Thank you. You back.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Congresswoman Luria.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. One of the things that strikes me the most when I look at the budget is the changes year over year to a 30-year shipbuilding plan, and I'm just trying to wrap my head around why there's so many changes in just 1 year. A few examples. In last year's 30-year shipbuilding plan, we had no cruiser decommissionings through 2023. This year we have 6. We had 3 minesweeper decommissionings. Now we have 11. We're going to decommission a carrier halfway through its 50-year life cycle. And the ship-to-shore connector, we've gone from 8 to 0. I'd assume when we generate a 30-year shipbuilding plan that it would be pretty consistent year over year in the nearest years. And the way I see a 20-year shipbuilding plan at this point, it's like the Navy's Vision 2050. And if that vision changes every year, do we really have a clear vision? An example I'll give from a hearing in 2015, Rear Admiral Manazir, the Air Boss, said, and I quote, "This force structure assessment," he was talking about the 2014 one, "is sized for a U.S. Navy force to conduct a complex, multi-phase campaign against a high-end adversary in one region and to deter or impose costs in another region. This force is designed to do that all the way to 2030. So that force structure was 308. The next year in the new force structure assessment, we said it was 355, and as we know, we're pending a new force structure assessment, which you've stated is going to even have a higher number. So why are there so many changes year over year, and do we really have a long-term vision towards 2050 for the Navy?
Ma'am, I think the answer to both of those questions is yes, we have a long-term vision. What has happened since 2016, I think, is indicative of just exactly how fast and quickly both the security environment is changing and also the technology landscape is changing. So each one of those platforms that you mentioned has its own justification. We're going to continue to assess the cruisers. We're going to not propose them for life extension, but we're going to take this year and study that to see if it is a good return on the taxpayers' investment, given the war-fighting punch that they bring. With respect to the mine countermeasure ships, we're going
So just in the interest of time, not to go line by line. It was really about a bigger vision, not
We
each
do have
of
a
the things,
vision,
'cause
but
there's
we also
thousands
are
of
operating
pages
in an
the budget,
extremely
so.
dynamic security and technology environment. And so I think that's why we're doing the force structure assessment. I would just say that I don't think I've predicted it's going to be higher or lower. I really am letting that run.
Okay,
without
well, I'll
trying to
look forward to
influence.
those results. So Secretary Spencer, so one of the main things that concerns me is the continuous change and churn that we have within the Navy. In my own 20-year career, for example, the surface warfare training pipeline changed 4 times. Again, I think an indication of no real vision. And, you know, we did have the terrible collisions in the Pacific in 2017, and we're implementing corrective actions for that part of our training. But I see the same thing in this year's budget and shipbuilding plan, more change, more churn. And I understand that technology changes, our potential adversaries change, as do their capabilities. But what do you think about the fact that it appears to the outside observer that the Navy doesn't have a shipbuilding plan that can stand for more than 1 year without significant changes?
It doesn't bother me whatsoever, Congresswoman, because the fact of the matter is we are adapting to the changes around us. The fact that we have accidents in the Pacific and we make a change to correct it, that is change. I don't think that's churn. I would hope that you would want me to be running at full speed, and when I run at full speed, I'm going to adapt and adopt and experiment as much as I can.
Okay, and so Admiral Richardson, with regards to the OFRP, CVN 77 recently entered Norfolk Naval Shipyard for a 28-month availability. Was 28 months ever part of the planned OFRP cycle?
Ma'am, it was originally in for a 16-month, that was what it was planned for.
And so Ike also finished their maintenance availability a year late recently, and they were the first to go through an OFRP cycle, is that correct?
They were one of the first, but I will tell you that this 28 is really a recognition that there is some emergent material issues that we've got to do that were not part of the original plan, and so
Okay.
we're recognizing that.
Are you able to consistently provide a 2+3 carrier presence over the FIDP?
For the most part, yes. Sometimes maintenance prevents us from doing that, but we're certainly striving towards that by the end of the FIDP.
So is the OFRP producing the deployed presence that was envisioned and testified to this committee in 2015? Because at that time, in the same hearing that we're having now, everyone affirmed that the minimum number of carriers to produce an acceptable level of risk is 11. So why in the 30-year shipbuilding plan do you not maintain, as required by law, the 11 carriers?
I think that with respect to the Truman overhaul, I think is where your question is centering, is we have to consider that as sort of a number of interrelated things. One is that we are biased towards naval power, and that that naval power may be maximized by some of these new technologies that are coming down right around the corner. The Harry S. Truman also delivers a tremendous amount of naval power. Resolving all that is being evaluated in this force structure assessment that you've referred to, as well as the combatant commanders updating their O plans. When we see those O plans and that assessment done, we're in a perfect position to respond to
As
what
I see we're out of time.
Okay, I
just-
think our time's run out, so thank you, Congresswoman. Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Spencer, my constituents in Pensacola love their Blue Angels. I'm hopeful that your budget fully supports the Blue Angels.
It does this time, sir, yes.
And would you comment about the role that the Blue Angels play and how important they are in the overall Navy?
Blue Angels are one of our key recruiting tools for the United States Navy. The Blue Angels, in concert with our TAC Demo Legacy Flight, really are one of the go-getters when we go out to air shows to help the recruiting effort.
We're proud of them. I would have to say, Admiral Richardson, I'm a little less proud of how we've dealt with some of these physiological episodes and how we've dealt with some of the training deaths. Would you comment on how the budget we have now leans into a solution set so that we don't continue to have those, particularly on the Goshawk?
Yeah, I think that first I want to come and brief you, because I think when you get the details, you would be proud. And we've attacked this from a multidisciplinary approach, not only in the Navy, but we've employed NASA, the private industry, and just about everybody who can help us here. We've employed the diving community to help us understand this better. It's about as complicated a problem as you can describe, the interface between a high-performance aircraft and a human body. But we're stepping through in a very disciplined way. We've seen in general the trend of those physiological episodes go down, in some cases almost being eliminated from certain type model series, and we look forward to making future progress.
I look forward to that briefing. One of the concerns I have is that when I visited NAS Pensacola, only one of the training simulators had a hypoxia-enabled OBOG system. And what I heard from the leadership and the students there is that if all of the students know that there is but one simulator that has the hypoxia simulation, then it misses the point of training students how to diagnose a physiological episode and then deal with their emergency protocols. Is there any thought given to how we train those students to react to those symptoms? And is it your view that maybe having more than one trainer with the hypoxia-enabled OBOG system might assist in that training?
I will say that a consistent approach to us responding to this is to increase the training across the entire naval aviation enterprise in terms of how pilots recognize and respond to a potential physiological episode in the air. I'm not sure exactly how the trainer in Florida relates to that higher.
Well, no, you would understand, though, that if there's sort of one system with that feature and the other systems don't have that feature, then you would expect that feature in the system that you knew had it and not in the systems that didn't. Just it was sort of a common sense reaction from some of the students. So I hope you'll take that in consideration as the Navy continues to address the problem. I wanted to shift gears and follow up on Mr. Langevin's questions about climate change. Admiral Richardson, what elements of the budget that the Navy's presented would we look to say that they acknowledge the challenges associated with climate change, that they lay out a strategy to deal with it?
Sir, I would point you to our MILCOM budget first and foremost, and the guidance that we've put out that anything new that's built has to be considerate of potential sea level rises and other factors of climate change. We're also working very closely, not just isolating to the on-base problem, but working closely with local communities, because typically we're right there with our neighbors in places like San Diego, Norfolk in particular, and other places.
Yeah.
So it's the MILCOM budget where I would
Appreciate that on basing, but for years I've heard my colleague, Mr. Garamendi, mention the impacts of climate change on the permissibility of the environment in the Arctic. We've heard chiefs from the Air Force and the Army testify that climate change impacts the permissibility of various environments, and they specifically reference the Arctic. Do you similarly hold that view, or is there a different view you hold?
I think we probably are first among equals in terms of the impact. Sea lanes are open now that weren't open before. Continental shelves are exposed now that weren't open before. The Arctic ice cap is as small as it's been in our lifetime. That's why we're invested up there. We took the Harry S. Truman Strike Group north of the Arctic Circle last year for the first time since 1991. We've had a consistent submarine program, including ICEX last year, where we surfaced 2 U.S. submarines and a British submarine through the ice. We have a robust program of exercises that we have been conducting and plan to continue to conduct in the Arctic to make sure that we can operate up there.
Is it fair to say then that you are having to react to the impacts of climate change in real time as they impact environments that our adversaries are interested in?
It's absolutely fair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Gantz, thank you for raising that issue. It saves me the time, and we do pay attention to polar security cutters. Thank you. Secretary Spencer, thank you for sharing information in time. Admiral Richardson, the same. You've been very forthcoming. I appreciate it. General Neller, I think you and I, not you, but I'll be visiting your folks in Lejeune a little later this afternoon. In fact, shortly after this question ends. With regard to Camp Lejeune, we've had a full discussion. We'll have more as a result of the visit that Mr. Lamboyd and I will be making today. General Neller, you've spoken to the issue of the deployment of troops, your troops, to the border wall and the readiness issues that have occurred as a result of that. I would appreciate later more information about specificity, specifically what you were referring to, Now, with regard to the issue that Mr. Wilson raised with regard to sea lift, we need to revisit the current NDAA as we prepare for the next NDAA and be really drilling down on what ships are going to be needed sooner than later. You mentioned this, Admiral Richardson. Of particular concern to mine is information that was given to us with regard to specialty ships that service other ships. and that they seem to be aging out sooner than later. So I'd like to have more full information on that and try to design that into the current NDAA and the timing issues surrounding that. So if you could give that information to us. Finally, with regard to MilCon, there is no way that we can avoid the fact that $6 to $8 billion is likely to be taken out of the current MilCon programs if the president is successful with his program. We need to know soon, like now, what programs are at risk, given the president's desire to take that money and spend it on the border wall. So for all three of you, if you could immediately, like when we return after the Easter recess, have that information in hand. We do know that $1 billion has already been taken out of the defense budget to be used on three contracts. The legality of that is questionable, but nonetheless, that appears to have happened. We'll be looking at that. So $1 billion is already gone. So I want to have very specific information upon our return as to what projects are at risk. And I think it is a fool's errand to assume that that money will be replaced in the coming appropriations. So that's money that is likely not to be available in the future. And we need to know the impact of it. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I specifically want to thank both of your families, Admiral General, for, I think it's probably safe to say you're both in your dream jobs right now, but your families have borne the brunt of your service, and I always want to keep the families in mind. I want to talk a bit about the submarine threat, Admiral Richardson, the evolution of the Chinese and Russian. My understanding in simple terms, Chinese are really ramping up production in numbers. The Russians in terms of approaching parity in quality. Can you share with us some of the successes you've had in tracking the recent out-of-area submarine deployments by the Chinese and the Russians? I understand that the P-8 has been instrumental. Its sonobuoy processing capabilities are critical to that success. And then if you could talk to me about sonobuoys in your funded and then your unfunded priorities.
Yeah, sir. I mean, what I think I need to do is come back and give you a classified brief on that. It's almost impossible to talk about that in an unclassified forum. But I will say that in this venue, that ASW has really become a team sport. It involves not only submarines but also surface ships, their towed array sonars, their radars, and then, as you mentioned, the P-8s and their sonobuoys. It all works together as a team, and we're getting more and more participation with our allies who can keep with us at that high end as well. With respect to sonobuoys, it is, it's like every other, it's like a piece of ordnance. When, you expend it, and it's done, and you need to kind of keep replenishing that. And as we continue to ramp up our capability, we're finding that we need to replace those sonobuoys at an increasing rate, and so our budget supports them.
Great. In terms of, again, sticking to the Chinese and where they're going, a number of studies that I've read, they're producing, and setting the qualitative parts of this aside, we're looking at 2 to 3 ships to 1 in terms of their production. I mean, it is one of the largest shipbuilding, they have one of the largest shipbuilding capabilities in the world by far. Is there as you're looking at your studies and in your studying the force structure, isn't there kind of a quality to quantity in and of itself? And looking at the high-low mix and looking at the cost savings of refurbishing frigates in particular at a fraction of the cost. So if these trends continue, do you agree with the assessments that quantitatively the Chinese will be on parity by 2030 and qualitatively, actually, let's say quantitatively exceed, qualitatively approaching parity by 2030?
Well, certainly they're the #1 shipbuilder in the world, right? And so from a quantitative standpoint, it's, they're ahead.
Maybe you
and
can just
open.
add to your comments, you had mentioned some incentives that you're looking at increasing our shipbuilding, domestic shipbuilding.
I would be willing to participate in a discussion to do everything we can to incentivize and increase domestic shipbuilding I think it's a national strategic imperative, and so there's a number of things that we might be able to do, and I'd look forward to the discussion, sir. And then with respect to the qualitative, I think we're going to continue to do our best to stay ahead from a qualitative standpoint from any other Navy in the world.
Congressman, just to add some of that's going to inform our discussions, our acquisition and sustainment arm through Secretary Gertz is actually doing a what happens when the balloon goes up with industry. We're having a forum that read America's Arsenal or the Freedom's Forge. It's that whole concept of what would happen to capacity and what could our suppliers expect to do if, in fact, we really surged the demand. That's happening the end of May. It's going to be interesting. We'll let you know.
New investments in modernizing the reserve fleet, which is sitting around 40 to 45 years. How are we going to address that, and how is the Navy? I mean, I understand it's not the sexy end of shipbuilding, but just assure this committee that you're taking that seriously.
Totally. This is square in my wheelhouse. Again, it comes to portfolio management, and I don't say that apologetically. That's how we're trying to balance this whole investment process, Congressman. The CNO gave you the overview. One of the things that I'd love to plant as an ask is the ability to buy more foreign used. Yes, we need to get our shipbuilding muscles back in shape, but in the immediacy, you've given me the ability to buy 2 and then go forward with champs, and then I can buy 3 more. I would like to have more the ability to have X dollars in an account and go out to the marketplace and buy as much as I could with that money.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Waltz. And the MARAD actually is going to be coming out with its maritime policy, which hasn't been updated since the 1930s. And we'll certainly going to have a hearing at Sea Power when that day comes, shortly, hopefully. Now I'd like to recognize the ranking member on the Sea Power Subcommittee, my friend, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Spencer, Admiral Richardson, General Neller, thank you so much for joining us. And Admiral Richardson, General Neller, thanks so much for your leadership, for your vision, and for your direction and your tenures there as chiefs. We appreciate that tremendously. I think you have really moved the ball forward for our nation's Navy and Marine Corps, and we appreciate that, created a legacy for many years to come. General Neller, I want to build on some comments that you've made concerning the devastation at Camp Lejeune from Hurricane Florence. As you pointed out, significant impact there. $3.6 billion of damage, $2 billion going towards demolition and rebuilding of those buildings, $1.3 billion going to fixing existing buildings, and about $300,000 going to fix IT systems and other repairs. So pretty significant. Your comment was this specifically. You said, if the Marine Corps had to fund that through its existing military construction budget, it would take that budget in its entirety for about 4 years. That's a tremendous impact. I want to get your perspective. Where does that leave not only Camp Lejeune operationally, but where does it leave the operational capability of 2MEF in its ability to respond to crisis? Because, we can look at buildings and those sorts of things and really just make it about bricks and mortar, or we can really talk about what does it do to affect operational capabilities. So could you give us that perspective on where things are with the Marine Corps?
Well, Congressman, I appreciate the question. Obviously, 2MEF remains an operational capable headquarters.
Yeah.
And a command element, and the Marines and their families that live and train and operate out of there are ready to go today. They're operating in a degraded environment, and we expect to do that when we forward deploy in an expeditionary scenario. We don't necessarily expect to do that when we're at home station. So over a period of time, I think it will. It could affect a lot of things. It could affect retention. It could affect our ability. Some of the ranges and training areas have been degraded. The beach area and access to the beach. You know, the shoreline on the East Coast is changing over time because of all the storms we've had, so it affects our ability to use that beach because that's a training beach. So some of the range areas, I think, are back in business because we had to clear some areas. So the impact on the New River and the Cherry Point side, you're operating in hangars where the office spaces and the planning spaces are degraded, and so you know, we expect our folks, when they forward deploy, to operate in austere conditions. We don't necessarily expect them to operate in that environment when they're at home station. So they're willing to put up with it for a while if they know there's a remedy coming, and we need to be able to offer them that remedy. This is not just an all-volunteer force, it's an all-recruited and all-retained force, and we need to provide them some level of capability at home station. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's got to be better than what we got down at Lejeune right now.
Very good. Thank you, General Neller. Secretary Spencer, I wanted to get your perspective on some comments that have been made by members of this committee with some concerns about what has happened recently. Their comments have been about taking away reprogramming authority. And as we know, reprogramming authority gives some flexibility, and we're just talking about the impact of the storms on Camp Lejeune, on Tyndall Air Force Base. So I wanted to get your perspective. How would you see the impact in your role and your capability there in making the necessary adjustments for a Navy Marine Corps team if that reprogramming authority was completely taken away from you?
Congressman, as I know you appreciate, because we've walked through this before, when we assemble the budget, we try to make it as tight and as focused as possible, but in the ever-changing world that we deal with, there's continual adjustments that have to be made, whether it be the purchase of armaments, whether it be maintenance, which is one of my biggest reprogramming drivers. It would be devastating to lose the reprogramming capability, sir.
Gotcha. Very good. Admiral Richardson, I wanted to build a little bit on your comments on the FY20 budget and how your focus is on preserving the industrial base. I think that's absolutely critical. But if you look at that, you see that there are no requests for additional construction for amphibious ships. The ship-to-shore connectors were taken out. We heard that referred to earlier. CVN 75 refueling. So the question becomes, if we're really about maintaining the industrial base as well as building that capacity, it does seem to be somewhat of a contradiction with those missing elements of what's in the budget request to your efforts to say that, you know, we want to make sure that we are multi-purposing in this effort to assure we have industrial capacity and capability at the same time that we're rebuilding the proper components of the fleet. So I just want to get your perspective on that.
And if you could make it sort of a shortened version, that
Sure.
would be
Yeah.
great. Thanks. Yep.
Sorry, Mr.
Abbreviated
Chairman.
version. Sir, I mean, we built 12 ships over in this budget, 55 over the FIDP. With some authorities, we could get started on the amphib ship and bring it back in and get started on that as quickly as we can. And so I think we do show a commitment there to shipbuilding and the national treasure that is the shipbuilding industrial base.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Thank you to the witnesses for your endurance. There actually is a request for a couple follow-up questions by some of the members. And again, at this point, I just want to yield to Mr. Thornberry, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary and Admiral, Ms. Loria kind of started down this road, but nobody's really pressed y'all on why the administration request is walking away from 25 years left of a carrier life. So I think we need to hear that explanation, and then the part B of that is if we, and I think the prevailing opinion in this committee is to refuel the carrier. Okay, if that's our decision, then what are you not able to do in the future, given the budgets that you assume are coming?
Congressman, let me walk you through the thought process. When we sat down to create the budget, then Deputy Secretary Shanahan really had us go through what I consider a very healthy assessment of where we are. And if you look at United States Navy, which probably has the largest installed base of capital assets, there are three buckets. that we have, which is our legacy systems, the modernization of our legacy systems, and then the funding of what I'm going to call R&D and/or Force 2.0, those weapons that are being developed now and those to come that we have to invest in. If we look at the two-carrier buy combined with the non-refueling of the Truman, the thought process was as follows. One, and I think this is lost in some of the conversations, the Ford-class carrier is not a Nimitz in any way. It has a 30% higher projection of a sortie launch, 25% fewer people to man it. We're expecting maintenance to be less. That will be proven out. If that's the case, we're modernizing the fleet. I look at, again, outside the wire, anywhere from oil industry to aviation to trucking. When in fact a new platform is presented to anyone who's modernizing in the 20% improvement range, people abandon assets to make the case to move towards more effective, more efficient, in our case, more lethal platforms. So this is not a one-to-one trade. This is modernizing the fleet with 3 platforms right off the bat that are more lethal. That was the thought process behind the Truman. Walking away from 25 years, abandoning an asset is not an easy decision. Where we are right now in the actual process, we can still come back to address it. The Joint Chiefs are doing studies, so are we, as far as requirement goes. But as far as a modernization argument, we believed it was a way to put the statement forward that we can take those monies and invest in Force 2.0, whether that be more submarines, whether that be advanced systems, whether that be future weapons that we don't have yet that we have to invest in.
We're obviously going to have a fair number of Nimitz-class carriers out on the seas. So I take your point. A new carrier is better than an old carrier, but an old carrier has substantial value, don't you think?
It has value, sir, but the business case is to what investment, to what I get on the other side of investing in new weapons.
Okay, and Admiral, I'd appreciate your comments, but also the second part of my question is, if we disagree and we say you're going to refuel the carrier, then what budget implications does that have for y'all in the coming years?
Sir, I'll just echo what the Secretary said, that one, the budget submission is about addressing the strategic priorities, which place a great responsibility on maximizing naval power. And how we do that going forward, first of all, the investment in the Ford class, I think to me, says that the aircraft carrier continues to be a relevant part of delivering naval power into the future. So there's been a lot of conversations about the vulnerability of the aircraft carrier, et cetera. A competently run aircraft carrier in a distributed maritime operations environment is a very lethal platform. And it's not the carrier itself, although this carrier is much better than the other. It's actually, innovation takes place on the air wing, and that is the striking power of the aircraft carrier. With respect to the balance between the Nimitz class and new technology, I think that's why we have to study this, which is why we have these studies going on in parallel to this, and also the industrial base, which has been mentioned a number of times. What is the impact of the industrial base of these decisions? And so it is about that balance, just as the Secretary articulated, whether we move forward and invest in some of these technologies or whether we deliver on a proven platform that will deliver new technologies through its air wing. And so I think we're in a position that wherever those studies take us in parallel with this decision, we can respond. If you were to restore the overhaul of the carrier, then we would just adjust our investments into some of those other parts of the budget. I think if it was consistent with the logic, we would draw off of some of that new technology investment. There'll be a considerable amount remaining, and we'll look for other less lethal places to find that money.
Okay. I would just say my sense is we ought to be having those conversations, and I understand your point, but if that's the way it goes, then it may have implications that we need to talk about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Thank you, Mr. Thornberry. So again, just to kind of get situational awareness here, we've got 2 members who have follow-up questions. We've already had 1 pass through, but we've been joined by Mr. Banks, who again was not able to be here for his first round of questioning. So Mr. Banks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Spencer, I recently introduced a piece of legislation to create military education savings accounts for military families. I don't know about you, but I've heard from so many military families and our men and women in uniform who go through that difficult process of moving from one installation to another, having their children placed in a good school in one place, but finding poor education options when they move to a new location. I wonder, do you hear those same complaints from families? There was a recent Military Times study that suggested that nearly half of our service members have either left the service or thought about leaving the service because of poor education options for their children. I don't know if you could have any remarks about that?
Congressman, yes. The way that I hear it is the inconsistency of the education available to those that are transferred around. There is a lack of consistency.
So you do hear from our sailors about that,
Yes.
the difficulty of that. I understand that you have been in contact with the Department of Education about that.
Yes, we have.
Education savings accounts, and is that a concept that appeals to you? That
Appeals.
would appeal to our families, our military families across the country?
To those that are educated on it on a launch basis, yes.
Okay. I appreciate your brevity, but is there a good way to with your business experience? Is there a good way to create a path toward creating an option like that for our families through the DoD? And would the Department of Navy potentially be interested in a pilot program that empowering the Navy to create?
I'll turn it over to the CNO, but as far as a businessman wearing my Title 10 hat, would love to see the option available.
Sir, I'll tell you, probably one of the most exciting parts of what's going on in the Navy right now is how we're transforming the way we do our human resourcing. And so we're very soon, with the Congress's support in terms of revolutionizing this, going to be able to understand the individual priorities of every one of our sailors, which would include their families and their education. And so we'll know better that if a sailor wants to achieve some geographic stability because he wants to put his kids through school, we'll have some options that we can appreciate and offer him as a part of his compensation package. It's really becoming a much more dynamic marketplace with the sailors increasingly participating in their future destiny, all the while meeting the needs of the Navy and the nation. And so this is an exciting part. If a pilot program that would further enhance a sailor's ability to control their own destiny, educate their children, we'd be excited to participate in something like that. As I end 37 years, we have 5 children. We've moved 21 times. We've experienced this personally, and it's something that we need to make as smooth as possible.
I appreciate that very much. As the NDAA soon approaches us, perhaps we could work with you to see if the Navy might be the best home for such a pilot program to support our military families as they face this difficult issue. I don't have more, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back with that, but this is an important subject. Something that I hear from so many families about is as they make that tough journey in their service and faced, our military families they're the last families that should be faced with the stress of choosing whether to send their children to a bad school or poor performing school because they're moved to a new station, and it's something I think this committee ought to do a lot more about. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Congresswoman Luria.
Well, thank you, and I wanted to pick up, Admiral Richardson, where we left off, because the current law says that we need to have 11 aircraft carriers, but you're bringing us a budget that actually is asking us in your 30-year shipbuilding plan to never attain that goal. So can you explain the disconnect? Are you coming to us and asking us to change the law about the number of carriers that we need?
I'm not aware of any legislative proposal to change the law there yet, it takes a while to get up to 12. It's outside the 30-year shipbuilding plan by the time we reach 12.
Well, I understand that, but we voluntarily let ourselves dip to 9 when we could have been at 10 during those time frames. My next question, and this is something that Chairman Forbes asked during a previous hearing when he was still here, has the United States Navy ever made the determination that the presence of an aircraft carrier strike group has had a significant role and deterring a conflict from going from phase 0 to phase 3?
The answer to that is yes.
Okay.
It's a tremendously cost-imposing thing. That's kind of that's a difficult question to answer briefly, but Yeah, and deterrence is a difficult thing to measure in general, you know, how did something not happen? But
So Secretary Stackley's response at the time was that he would go as far to say that it's the cornerstone of our maritime strategy. Do you in principle agree with that assessment?
it is the fundamental fighting element of the United States Navy right now.
Okay. And Secretary Spencer, you quoted some efficiencies that we gained through the Ford-class aircraft carrier, and one of those is that you assessed that the maintenance costs go down by 20%. So the Ford-class carrier cycle, and this was also previously reported in a hearing before the Congress, is that cycle's 43 months versus the 36 months that we have for the Nimitz class. Which should allow the ship to deploy more frequently over its life cycle and only have to dry dock once every 12 years and result in this overall 20% reduction in maintenance. However, we're still planning to operate on the 36-month cycle, so it doesn't appear that although we have built an efficiency of having a 43-month cycle, more availability to deploy and more presence, that we're actually planning to execute to that and take advantage of the 20% reduction in maintenance that this should afford us. Can you explain that disconnect?
I think you'll see us work that into the plan.
So then would the OFRP change and all surface combatant cycles would extend to 43 months?
I'll let the CNO address that, but if in fact we have the efficiencies, I don't know why we wouldn't accept and avail ourselves to them. But it's not universal across all forms.
Yeah, ma'am, as you alluded, we're going to have to take a look at the escorts, the auxiliary ships and everything that supports that strike group, the air wing, and so it really is a force that deploys together. The fact that we designed in 20% less maintenance costs, we certainly intend to take advantage of that, whether it's a 36 or a longer month OFRP.
Okay.
And the OFRP in general is designed to be dynamic. We've changed it several times, as you and I have discussed. I mean, this is not something that is written in stone. It will change as well to respond to circumstances.
Thank you. And so over the course of several hearings that we've had on this topic, both in the full hearing as well as within Sea Power, I've tried to distill the difference between actual presence versus availability to deploy and surge capability that you're creating with the OFRP. And I just wanted to close out my comments with something that Secretary Mabus said during his last hearing before this committee. His quote is, "While there's been discussion about posture versus presence, the simple fact is that for the Navy and Marine Corps, our posture is presence, and there is no next best thing to being there. Maintaining that presence requires gray hulls on the horizon." And have you changed in views, Mr. Secretary, from your predecessor as far as the importance of presence? And we've seemed to have emphasized surge capability over presence. Can you comment on that?
A policeman on every corner will deter crime. I'd love to have a gray hull on every corner. I do not have that luxury. So it's a portfolio management, risk management model that I must deal with. Yes, posture is presence, and yes, that is a deterrent. I have to use it judiciously, or I produce it judiciously for the COCOMs to use judiciously.
Okay, and why is it that they are not getting their requested amount? I've had the opportunity to ask 3 COCOMs before this committee what percentage of presence they're getting versus their request, and CENTCOM said about 1/5, EUCOM 1/3, and PACOM, obviously they have the additional presence of the carrier on station in 7th Fleet, said about 70%. So is there a disconnect in the process by which the COCOMs are requesting this, but we're not providing that? Or do we need to look at the realism of the request that they're making versus off the threats in their theater?
I'll let the CNO dive in here also, but I mean, it is a supply demand. And we try to do the best we can, obviously, managing the risk that we have. I'm sure as a combatant commander, the balancing threat versus asset is a model they have to deal with. They feed it into the machine, they feed it into our request. We have the assets that we can provide to them.
If I could just pile onto that, General Neller and I both worked in the part of the Joint Staff that sort of did this math over time. I think historically we meet about 50% of the combatant commanders' requests as a joint force, and that would include the Navy if you average everything out. And it goes to exactly what the Secretary said. It's a matter of what forces are available versus the demand. The difference in that is risk, and we prioritize our presence so that we can minimize our global risk. That again is a very dynamic scenario, and so we work that continuously, but every year they redo the entire plan. And so one thing we have to also address is that we don't overdrive the force employment part of the equation so that we underdrive the training, maintenance, training, and certification parts of the equation, or we'll find ourselves back into the same imbalance that led to the unreadiness in 7th Fleet.
Let me just add on that. I don't want to get into too much information here in a public setting, but there's about 10 capabilities that the Department of Defense has that are never met for the COCOMs. And they're unconstrained in their request. They can say, this is what I believe I require to do my mission. And so we meet that. But naval forces, submarines, cruiser destroyers, carrier strike groups, amphib ready groups, ARGMUs, are always deficient, which is a capacity. And so we do the very best to meet that. And that's the tension between the COCOM and the force provider. So that's why we have the discussions about how large a Navy do we need to have to meet this. And I think, not going to put words in Secretary Mavis's mouth, but I believe what he was trying to do at that time is to say, we need to have enough presence, which means we need to have a larger Navy.
Okay.
Which our 30-year shipbuilding plan supports.
So we need to, Commandant, you said we need to do the most we can do to meet that. Yeah, I'll go back to my very first question I asked earlier in the hearing. We're planning to decommission 6 cruisers, no investment in the ship-to-shore connector, decommission an aircraft carrier halfway through its life cycle, and decommission 11 minesweepers. Yet we're doing everything we can do to meet that, yet we're voluntarily reducing our capability and the number of ships that we have over the next several years.
That has to be balanced, Congressman, with what it costs. It might not be economically worthwhile with the risk balance to keep those cruisers going versus where those dollars can be placed for more effective deterrence in some other asset.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, gentlemen. It was a good exchange. Final word, Mr. Gallagher.
Well, let me follow up on that. I think I would like to associate myself with the thrust of Ms. Lauria's line of questioning, which is to say, there simply is no way to do deterrence by denial, particularly in the Indo-PACOM theater, unless we find a way to get more Navy, Marine Corps tooth into the blunt and contact layers, right? But then the question becomes, to your point, Mr. Secretary, what's the right mix of tooth? What's the right mix of ships and sailors and Marines? And what's the overall cost? Because it doesn't need to be all carriers. Obviously, we have a lot of tools at our disposal, and I'd just like to push on that. Admiral Richardson, in your design for maintaining maritime superiority 2.0, you argue that Chinese and Russian actions may imperil the, quote, diplomatic, economic, and military bonds that link the United States to its allies and partners. And if I understood your answer to my previous question, you believe that the future frigate will play a critical role in the contact and the blunt layers in preventing this from happening and in strengthening these diplomatic, economic, and military bonds. So to get to the issue, this sort of trade-off that we have to make, I appreciate the desire to control costs. I understand that the Navy can't afford a DDG light, but Secretary Spencer, can you walk me through what went into lowering the projected cost of the second FFGX from 950 to 800? In other words, what specific costs and capabilities did you remove from the program?
Didn't remove anything, Congressman. That's a great question. That's learning curve. You build something once, you know how to build it. You build it twice, you know how to build it better. 3, 4, 5, you come down the industrial learning curve. That's what you're witnessing for the 800. No capability or capacity reduction.
And then, obviously, the frigate has an aggressive detailed design and construction award timeline. And if we sort of fall behind that timeline, it's going to result in, a loss of thousands of jobs. Do you believe you're on track to execute this contract by the end of FY20?
We are, and I want to make sure that you understand when we say aggressive, it's aggressive on a historical basis. These are all proven form designs.
Sure. And Admiral Richardson, if you would comment.
It goes to what the Secretary has talked about in terms of bringing industry in early on into the requirements process. And so that's been a tremendously informative discussion, and it enhances the confidence that we're going to be moving into the frigate with more mature technology, proven hull designs, leveraging combat systems, the latest versions, and really just Now it comes down to integration of that technology, and so we have good confidence. The request for proposals went out just a little bit early, and so we're stepping through this on pace.
Yeah. And again, I would like to just get back to my colleague's line of question. I mean, I think, again, we can have a debate about the right mix of ships, but I think in any analysis, particularly as you look at the first island chain in the priority theater, I mean, it will require more ships. Now, we could have a higher degree of autonomous ships. We can do creative things with those ships, like put LRASMs on Mark VI patrol boats and things like that, so we have to be thinking creatively. But I think we all want to execute a plan with as much urgency and alacrity as humanly possible. And if we keep sort of changing the plan and timelines get delayed, then I think that's where a lot of us get frustrated.
So I think one of the biggest changes of the last year's 30-year shipbuilding plan to this year's is that, one, we all agree a bigger Navy is what the nation needs. That's why we're building towards 355 ships. This year's plan gets to 355 20 years earlier than last year's plan. And so I think these are changes that the nation would be in favor of to reach our goal 20 years earlier.
And I'll betray my bias in a closing comment here as a Marine and as a navalist. As I read the NDS and NSS, and I've tried to read it closely, I think it's asking the Navy and the Marine Corps to do a lot more and play a unique role. I mean, if you just look at, again, the priority theater and the shift to deterrence by denial, and I don't mean that as a knock on the Army and the Air Force and everyone we work with, they have a critical role, but I think in particular, that Navy Marine Corps team is going to be critical if we're going to actually implement the National Defense Strategy. And it's remarkable to me that we actually have a bipartisan agreement on this major conceptual shift contained within those documents, but implementing it is a whole nother story, and that's going to be a task for all of us here, and it's a budget process, it's a strategy process, and so I just hope to work with all of you as we try and simply implement the National Defense Strategy, and if nothing else, that we don't slide backwards over the next 2 years after having 2 years of success in this committee. And with that, I yield my remaining 8 seconds.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. So I think we did it. Just want to again thank the witnesses for your endurance again, and obviously we had the delay because of the votes, but I really appreciate you hanging in there with us and being patient to answer all the questions. And with that, declare the hearing closed.
much.